37 years. Individual liberties, individual rights. Majority rule is the group with the most votes wins power over governing decisions. In other words, things like how the government spends its money, right? That's a big thing. Where do we build roads? Do we even build roads? Do schools get money? Do schools have to do certain things? Right? So governing decisions. Majorities can trample individual rights, and well-organized minorities can subvert majority will. A good example of this, and we're going to talk about the fact that there are states, such as Oklahoma, but Oklahoma is about a medium-sized state, actually, right in the middle. But there are states, and I think that we talked about this, Peter, with one of your students. Is she here today? But we talked about the fact that states have representation no matter how small they are. So sometimes that means that states and populations of those states, which are much smaller, have more power than do people, right? Well-organized minorities. But a key, and this is going back to Abigail Adams, she's completely right about this. Liberties without laws descend into anarchy. We have to have a framework to both protect those liberties, right? But also put some bounds. And generally, when we talk about liberties, we'll talk about some liberties in a couple of weeks, but generally we talk about liberties, the idea is my liberty ends where my fist hits your nose, right? In other words, my liberty pertains to my body and my stuff. If I injure someone else or cause harm to someone else in some way, then that's where my liberty ends, okay? The Declaration of Independence, just a reminder, we have these maxims of freedom. All men are created equal. Governments are required through social contract to provide life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And injustice means that people have a duty to revolt. Okay? Just a reminder. Letter from Birmingham jail. Martin Luther King Jr. says, I am here because injustice is here. And a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He also says freedom is never given freely by the oppressor. And this is not something we really talked about in this class. It has to be demanded by the oppressed. That's the first part. But then he goes on to say, justice too long delayed is justice denied. Right? And so if the system is, if we say, well, just wait. It'll get better. We just need to wait. Well, how long? Right? Justice too long delayed is justice denied. He also talks about the difference between just and unjust laws. Right? And you guys remember what he said about this? Because we didn't talk about this in class. Yeah?
So, my students that I talked about is that there's this kind of idea that morality and law are not mutually exclusive, that there can be moral laws and immoral laws, and just because something is legal doesn't mean that it's right, and just because something is illegal doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong either. And he uses things like the Holocaust is an example of this. Like if you were caught hiding a Jewish person, you could be punished, but that doesn't mean that doing that was wrong. So that's kind of the idea.
Great, that's a great answer. And that's a good example that he uses as well in terms of what a just law is versus an unjust law. Anybody else want to add to that? Okay, thank you. And so we've gone back to those ideas of democracy, right? But the Constitution is different than the Declaration. It's more elitist. Absolutely. I told you. Madison, genius, absolutely elitist. Right? There's no question about that. They wanted the best to govern. They thought, hey, by putting these safeguards in place, we're going to get the best possible people making the best possible decisions. And so in this way, it really echoes. Have you read Plato's The Republic? Anyone? Okay. So it was a while ago, so I won't put you on the spot. I read Plato's Republic in the 9th grade to get an A in a class. You couldn't get an A unless you read it book, and I chose Plato's Republic because I knew that the teacher hadn't read it. So what I talked about with it was not the point, really. I didn't read it, I'll be honest, right? And it's years later when I read Plato, and he's talking about the Republic. In particular, he's talking about, hey, look, a democracy is not a good idea, right? And that's what he says. Why isn't a democracy a good idea? Do you remember that, anyone?
It's because, like, at the end of the day, people are always going to come after their own self-interest, and all it takes to destroy democracy is for enough people to agree on something bad.
Exactly. All it takes to destroy democracy is for enough people to agree on something bad, right? And so Plato says, hey, look, people who are educated, this is who should rule, because they're going to be good for everybody, right? We don't want it to be too elite, because then they'll only look out for their own self-interest. And so there's this, it's a delicate balance, right? And so the founders read these classics and they thought about them, and they thought they don't have a real point, but they thought, hey, look, people ought to have a voice, but they ought to not make the laws, right? So a republic is where we end up. The Senate, the president, the judiciary, these are all either indirect appointment or indirect election or appointment, okay, initially in the Constitution. So the Senate, we elect our state legislatures originally in the Constitution, and our state legislature then elects the best person to be the senator, okay? This changed 100-ish years ago, 120 years ago. Okay, about 120 years ago, we have a constitutional amendment. And that's the key I want you guys to remember as we talk about the Constitution. Each amendment changes what has gone before. Okay, that's significant. So we change this and we say, hey, you know what? People ought to have more of a voice. And so we're going to let the states as a whole elect their senators. Okay. The president, indirect election, and this is a weird one, okay? The Electoral College, you guys have heard of that, right? And so we are supposed to, under the Constitution, elect a slate of electors. So, I could run as a presidential elector in a state. I could be like, hey, I'd like to be a presidential elector, you guys are like, and I get enough votes. Oklahoma has a total of 7. Right? And I'm the top 7 vote getter, and then the 7 of us go to this convention and we elect the president. That's the way it could happen. That is not the way it does happen. Instead, there's a slate that each party or each party that the presidential candidate is representing puts forward, and those are the people that vote. We'll talk more about this later, but it limits that. It says people are voting for the president, but they're not really, because you can't, okay? Only the House is directly elected. Again, they said, hey, look, we don't think that Aristotle's completely right. There needs to be some sort of check on that power, okay? But the House is directly elected. It's less radical than the Declaration of Independence. Wanted indirect consent, filtered through representatives. And it's really going to emphasize stability, order, and slow change. Something we didn't get to in this class on Monday was an important point. The U.S. Constitution is the oldest written functioning constitution in the world. I want you to think about that because we're not an old nation. We don't have a tremendously long history. We cannot say, hey, look, the United States as a nation in some form or another has been around for 1,000 years, or 2,000 years, or 4,000 years, and other countries can. We're new. But we have the oldest written functioning constitution, and that is a significant thing. Okay? And the reason why it has lasted is because it is flexible and vague. We haven't amended it very often, only 27 times. 2 of those times were policy amendments. We said, no one can drink alcohol. And then we said, yes, you can. Right? Those are 2 of the amendments, and we tried to do policy, right? So we said, hey, not so many policy amendments. For the most part, the amendments to the Constitution have made more protections for individual liberty, have limited government more, and have increased popular participation. So I told you about the Senate, right? Another constitutional amendment, obviously, is going to be giving all men the right to vote, right? And then all people the right to vote. And then all people over the age of 18 the right to vote, as opposed to 21. Okay? These are constitutional amendments that have increased participation and increased input into government, whereas we've limited. So we said the president can only serve 2 terms, right? That's a good example of a limit we've put in. But we've increased liberty. In the 14th Amendment, which we will talk about, we specifically require that states respect those liberties in the Bill of Rights. Okay? Specifically, we say, hey, look, we're all citizens, and we have to treat everyone like they're a citizen. It took the court a little bit to interpret it that way, but that's what we got. But again, there's some good reasons for no ratification. Patrick Henry's going to argue. He's going to say, hey, look, my biggest problem with the Constitution is that it is not a compact of states like the Articles of Confederation. Instead, it says we the people. It's a compact between people, and we all know that unwise majorities are a problem, right? He says, our country has become a great, mighty, and splendid nation, not because government is strong and energetic, but, sir, because liberty is its direct end and foundation. He says, look, we're awesome. People are like, yeah, we've had 3 rebellions and the economy's tanking. Okay? It's only been 10 years. Okay? In one great consolidated empire of America, government will not have sufficient energy to keep them together. It's incompatible with the genius of Republicanism. He says, I dread the operation of it on the middling and lower class of people. It is for them that I fear the adoption of the system. I've talked to you a little bit about Patrick Henry, right? Federalist One Response, very cheekily, snarkily, Patrick Henry, and says, you know, there's some obstacles to ratification, and that includes the interest of men who will benefit from the subdivision. Patrick Henry, we're talking to you. Into several partial confederacies that from its union under one government. And they said, we're also concerned because, Patrick Henry, you're using your oration skills, your oratory skills, and we're concerned that you're talking about fear in politics as in religion. It is equally absurd to aim at making proselytes, followers, by fire and sword. Heresies in either politics or religion, corruption in either, can rarely be cured by persecution. They're saying, remember the Crusades? Those didn't work out so well. The Spanish Inquisition, anyone? Of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues, a word you guys all know, starting out as demagogues and ending as tyrants. Beware, beware, beware. So there are some compromises, right? And this happens at the Constitutional Convention. The Great Compromise is going to shape state power. Small states with small populations are going to have equal power in the Senate, and they're going to have a little extra power whenever it comes to electing the president. The compromise over slavery shapes attitudes towards race that we continue to deal with today. Why compromise about slavery? I told you guys the majority of founders said, hey, look, we really think that we should end slavery. So why compromise? Why'd they do it? Yeah. Because they needed the South. Right? I mean, that's really what it came down to. So they compromised. They said, and again, Jefferson's like, in 50 years we'll overturn this. It took 100, but it took some time. But that was part of it, right? We have a compromise regarding the executive. That election, I told you that Madison came with a constitution ready. When the legislature, Congress, would elect the president, okay? And so the Electoral College was, and people were like, we want elected by the people directly. And so this is a compromise between those two, the Electoral College. And then the powers were really unclear, and Hamilton got to write it, and Hamilton's, Alexander Hamilton loved George Washington. I mean, he's like, he's the greatest, everybody knows he's the best, and to be fair, the whole nation did. And George Washington absolutely could have been King of America. There's no question. And when we talk about the presidency, I'll say it again, but it's really a lucky thing that he was a small d Democrat, believing in democracy. And then they left political equality and the right to vote to the states. This was another thing. Hey, states, we're going to trample on all your power. You're still going to have some power. Okay? We're going to leave that to you. So the debates then and now, these are some questions for you. We have national power versus state power. A large and diverse nation necessary to preserve rights versus an extended government leading to the end of liberty and self-government. So in what ways do we continue to have the same debates today between national power and state power, for example? Yeah. Roe v. Wade is a good example of that. Absolutely. Okay. What else? Abortion rights, generally, right? Or the rights of women over their bodies. I was just going to say vaccinations. Vaccinations, perfect. Or COVID response in itself, right? I think that's a good one. What else? Eric is very good at picking out people.
Usually nice.
Yeah, hold on.
Gun laws is another recent one that's been thrown around.
Okay, gun laws, right? And that goes to a couple of things. We have something in the Second Amendment. Second Amendment for, gosh, 200 years was interpreted one way, and then it got interpreted a different way recently, right? That's a good point. Okay. What else? Yeah.
Like what states choose to teach in school and what's
Sure, absolutely. So, and we're seeing that at the state level in Oklahoma right now. That's a perfect example where there are laws regarding what, and this is, as opposed to other states, that's true, but also opposed to localities. Local school boards are getting the fire for their decisions on curriculum, and so it's going even further down. Yeah.
So this is kind of for states choosing marijuana as legal or not.
Oh,
Is it also
absolutely.
being issued federally?
Yeah, because still federally, marijuana is considered a Schedule I drug, okay? Which means that states even regulating that in terms of medical marijuana are, they can't really do that. The federal government has to do it through the FDA. But
What's interesting is the FDIC, you can't put marijuana money into a bank. That's kind of an interesting.
and that creates a whole different, where do you put the money, right? It can't be from that, it has to go to something else. And so it makes the whole business shady.
My side hustle,
What?
my side hustle.
Yes. Eric is a medical marijuana purveyor on the side.
Definitely.
And if you believe that, I have the London Bridge just around the corner.
Another recent big one is abortion, like among like all the states.
Oh, absolutely. Abortion and women's rights, absolutely. One right back here on the back. Were you raising your hand? Disrespectful.
Florida's don't say gay bill, kind of?
Yeah, and kind of Florida's whole woke bill, I think but in that, a federal judge said, you can't tell people, that's clearly freedom of speech. I mean, that's a freedom of speech thing. And so on that side, there's been a district court judge, but we often have courts, and we're going to talk about that as the arbiters between the states and the federal government.
Oh, that state down south, well, straight below us, the St. God We Trust posters having to be displayed in the schools if it's donated. That's been a really interesting topic this week, because people are bringing it in Arabic with the pride flag on the background, all these other things, and they're rejecting them.
Which they can't do that. I mean, the law says that custodians, they have to put it up. People get really touchy whenever you point out there are other ways to look at things.
This goes on with the endowment trust. So public schools, they can't like make you pray or anything, obviously, because of First Amendment. But like, I know some people get mad that they will do like a moment of silence.
Well, and we have a case this summer that we'll talk about. I mean, we have the Lemon laws, or the Lemon case, where essentially we say, hey, look, there has to be separation between church and state in this way, okay? But
And then also like going off of that, because I was sworn houses. So the pledges, people would also not be one was to have them come and do the pledges. So we would do the Pledge of Allegiance, the Texas Pledge, and then a moment of silence.
it's a tremendous amount of pledging.
I would never pledge to Texas. Not one bit.
Interestingly, the Pledge of Allegiance only added under God in the 1950s.
Corporal punishment or death penalty.
Corporal punishment, the death penalty between states, big differences, okay? All right, these are great examples. These are great examples. So we have a lot of clash, and we have state governments and national governments. And I want you guys to think about who has done a better job of protecting liberty? State governments or the federal government, right? And I think you're gonna find it kind of depends, right? I mean, it kind of depends. And so think about that in terms of when we're talking about a federal system, and we're gonna have the Speaker of the House, the Oklahoma State Legislature is gonna come in and talk to us. We're gonna have lots of people come in and speak to us, and I want you to recognize that they represent you at the state level, making laws at the state level, or they represent you at the federal level, making laws at the federal level. All right, so we have compromises to ratify. The Federalists say, hey, look, we'll make some amendments if you'll just shut up and sign, right? This is essentially what it comes down to. We know it's not perfect, but we need something, and this is better than what we have. Again, we the people, in order to form a more perfect unit, right? This still isn't it. This still isn't it. Jefferson and Madison are introduced 19 in 1789. Of those, 10 becomes a Bill of Rights. A lot of them get consolidated. One becomes the 27th that says members of Congress cannot give themselves a raise after they have, while they're in office, it can only go into effect after their term is over. Okay, so that's interesting. That actually gets, just as you know, did you guys read about this actually in Cengage? It used to be in Cengage, but it may be gone at this point. But this is a case where a student in a class like this had to write about an amendment, and this student found this amendment and said, hey, look, this is one that never got passed, it should be passed. And the professor said, that'll never happen, gave him a B. The student, like, took it nationwide and got it ratified by the states. It was still dormant. Okay. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. They are drafted in response to anti-federalist concerns about lack of protection for basic civil liberties. Okay. It takes the 14th Amendment to apply it to the states, which we will talk about. Remember, and this is important, for example, the 10th Amendment says anything that we have not given strictly to the federal government is left to the states or to the people, respectively. Okay, that's what it says. But as the Constitution gets amended, that means the Congress sometimes gives itself more power and takes that power away from the states. The 14th Amendment is an example of that. The 15th Amendment is an example of that. At the end of it, it says, hey, look, you can, if it's not enforced, then Congress can pass legislation to enforce it. The 13th Amendment, the 14th, the 15th, actually all the amendments, except for a couple since the 12th Amendment, have added power to the federal government and taken power away from the states. The Constitution has 6 really big ideas. Did any of you take a government class in college or in high school? 1, 2, 3. No, pretty big. That's a large number. So that's more than usual, all right? And so you may have talked about these 6 big ideas. And I just want to go through them. One is limited government. Specific powers are denied to the federal government. For example, it says you cannot place religious qualifications on office holders. That is a denial of power, right? When office holders in the United States say, hey, and I've heard many of them say, this is a Christian nation, and so there should be a Christian test or a Bible test to be able to vote or be a member of Congress. I've heard members of Congress say this, right? And I'm like, yeah, the Constitution, it's really clear, okay? The First Amendment, we'll get to that in a second, but that's a specific limitation in the body of the Constitution itself. It also grants power to government, but it grants power to different parts of government. Congress has this power. The president has that power. The courts have this power. And by saying this is congressional power, for example, the budget, okay, this is a power of Congress. It comes from the people. That means that the president can't move that money somewhere else. It also means the president can't use a line item veto, though Congress passed one. And then the Supreme Court said, no, that's your power. You can't do that, okay? And Congress, a lot of times, does give more power to the president to do things. Why would Congress do that? Why would Congress be like, hey, so President, could you just handle this, please? Why would they do that? Any ideas? I got one. Why would you give me that power? Why would you say, hey, instead of me deciding what I'm going to read for this class to learn, I want you to teach me? Why would you give me that power? It's just easier, right? It's easier. You have something else?
Oh, I was just gonna say people are just lazy.
And people are lazy. And also, members of Congress have to run for office every 2 years, and they don't want that coming back and hitting them. And so they're just like, So we give the president that power and the president's clearly abusing it and they can just be mad about it, right? Or we give the president that power. Isn't that awesome that the president did that? Depending on which side they're on, right?
Always comes back to bite.
It always comes back to bite.
Bite.
Oh, bite.
Yeah.
Yeah, it comes back to bite. Bite, not bite it. Yeah, okay, right. Okay, so protection of rights in the Constitution and Bill of Rights, we talked about those that were in the Constitution that were protected specifically, but the Bill of Rights, which we're gonna spend a lot of time on when we talk about civil liberties, protects a lot of individual rights, okay? Republicanism, right? And this is going back to Aristotle, okay? But it's this idea of majority rule within a framework of law. The rule of law is overall, okay? And that's the Constitution and the laws that are formed lawfully for the Constitution. Was this created lawfully under the Constitution? Yes, then it is the law of the land. Now, going back to Martin Luther King Jr., is it necessarily a just law? I don't know. If it's not, maybe we the people need to do something about it. Okay? Checks and balances. This is one of those things that, again, the example of if the president oversteps, the president can be impeached. The president can be thrown out of office. Also, the judiciary can be impeached for bad behavior. Okay? By Congress, they can do those things. There's also another kind of check and balance. Congress can pass a law such as the line item veto, and the judiciary can say, unconstitutional, and then it's no longer a law, right? Or Congress can pass a law and the president can say no, right? It's not absolute, right? It can be overturned. For example, I always give this example. There was a veto by George W. Bush in like 2005, I think, of this water bill that members of Congress, bipartisan, had been working on for years in terms of making sure that there was water available everywhere so there wasn't drought. And they've been just, compromise after compromise, thousands of pages long. They've been working on it for years. And they pass it, everybody's happy, it's finally gotten through Congress, and the president goes, you know what, I have some people in West Texas would be really irritated by this, veto. And he vetoes it, sends it back to Congress, Congress overrides the veto like that. Because they're like, no. We worked on this really hard. You don't get that much say, right? And so there's also that balance as well. Federalism is another check. We talked about this, the way that different states, for example, are going to pass laws that fit their people better, right? That's part of the idea, okay? But also that there's lots of accountability, right? We have accountability at the state level and the federal level as well. And you guys, we handed out some things to register to vote. Many of you are registered to vote. This is a time to remind you of something. This is a midterm election year. You're like, yeah. And I went to vote the other day. Don't worry, I'm going to put up the TikTok soon. All right. Okay. But I went to vote the other day, and the guy there who was running the vote or running the thing, you know what? We didn't take attendance. Eric, would you know?
I was just thinking.
Who was running it said, oh, too bad you're filming it now. This is just kind of a boring runoff primary. It's not a really good year like a presidential year. And I was like, see, that's a problem, right? These laws affect us, and that's what I want to say to you. There are laws, your members of Congress are up for election. Sometimes some of your senators in Oklahoma, both senators are up for election. All your members of Congress are up for election. That's the federal level. The governor is up for election. Our state executive is up for election. Your people who represent you, attendance is open. So be sure to do that. Open the attendance tab on Cengage. Okay. Go to your app on your phone in Cengage. Open the attendance tab. It is live. Okay. But all these people are up and they make decisions about your life every single day. Okay, so vote. Separation of powers, that's modest view. You have the power to do this, you have the power to do that, you have the power to do this. And yes, there are checks, but we clearly are making sure that this branch is doing this and this branch is doing that. And then popular sovereignty. It's a really big deal, majority rule. It's consent of the governed, and it means that if you don't like what your state is doing right now, you need to vote against it. Okay? Democratic accountability. That's exactly what this is. If you do like, you need to vote for it. Okay? Democratic accountability. There's some big threats to democracy that our Constitution is having trouble overcoming. Okay? One is presidential secrecy. The president has created, the presidential establishment, which we'll talk about, has become a series of people who are loyal only to the president. And this enables the president to keep secrets in such a way that are detrimental sometimes to the people. We see this with Richard Nixon. You see this recently with President Trump. And it is a danger to democracy. Hyperpartisanship is also a danger to democracy. It's a threat to democracy. If we are unable to compromise on basic things about what is good for the people, like that water bill I was talking about, if we're unable to say, hey, a Democrat has a good idea, okay, so I'm gonna, listen to that idea and we're gonna have a conversation about it. Or a Republican, that's a pretty good idea. And so let's talk about that, right? If we're unable to do that, we're saying, you know what, that's okay, but it would be better if, right? Compromise. If we're unable to even talk to each other like we're not enemies, then that is a danger to democracy. Finally, something that we have a problem with is when three branches are united in thinking that ignoring the Constitution is in the nation's best interest. We see this in the internment camps during World War II of Japanese Americans. We see this in terms of segregation and housing discrimination. We see this in terms of the Patriot Act following 9/11. There are clear instances where every branch of government was united in ignoring the Constitution. And that's a danger. Okay, so I have a poll for you guys. Which limit do you think is most important on government? So again, open up your app. You guys are actually going to get out of here like 2 minutes early. You should be so happy.